Hello, my name is John Radley. I'm South Atlantic Council staff, and today I'll be going over a scoping overview for Snap Grouper Amendment 47, which includes 4 hire permit modifications. A brief outline of what I will review. First will be the scoping overview of the scoping process. This will be followed by what the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, otherwise referred to as the Council, is considering, followed by the input that the council is hoping to receive, and you'll notice questions from the council with specific questions on different topics, how to provide your comments to the council, and during the webinar sessions there will be a question and answer session on the material covered at the end, as well as an opportunity for public comment. Before getting to the details amendment, I'd like to review what is scoping. Scoping has 2 main purposes. One, to inform the fishing public that the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council may propose new regulations or change existing ones, and also to allow the opportunity for the fishing public to comment on the issue or identify other related issues that may need the council's attention. Initially, a management issue is identified. This is followed by scoping, where the public provides comments on ways to address the management need. The council reviews these comments and develops management actions and alternatives. This is followed by public hearings, where the public provides comments on the management actions and alternatives that the council has developed. The council then reviews this input, modifies the actions and alternatives, selects their preferred alternatives, and then the amendment moves towards final approval. This is the last chance for public input at the final council meeting. And so we're fairly early in the process, as you can see the arrow there by scoping. And scoping really is the first and best opportunity to make suggestions for the council to consider before an amendment is developed. In Amendment 47, the council is considering 2 major issues. One is implementing a moratorium on South Atlantic charter headboat for snapper grouper permits, otherwise referred to as snapper grouper for hire permits. A moratorium would limit entry into the fishery instead of the current open access structure. And the other issue being considered modifications to the prohibition on retention of snapper grouper species in state waters on board federally permitted for hire vessels when the species close to harvest in federal waters. So this is really looking at a condition of the current permit. And so initially we'll discuss the for hire permit moratorium, and there's a wide range of options that will be presented. And it's the council's intent to show that there are several possibilities that could be considered if entry is limited into the for hire snapper grouper fishery. The council is considering a moratorium in order to evaluate whether a limited entry system or other modifications to how the for hire snapper grouper fleet is managed or operates are desirable. The concept of limiting the number of snapper grouper for hire permits has been raised by the snapper grouper advisory panel in public comments to the council and during the snapper grouper visioning process. A little bit of background on the permit moratorium. The council members have voiced both concern over implementing a moratorium on snapper grouper for hire permits, as well as support for potential benefits of limiting entry into the fishery. Some council members believe that a moratorium could help with logbook reporting compliance, recreational data quality, stabilizing participation in the for hire fishery, situations of potential localized vessel overcapacity, business planning, professionalizing the for hire fleet, and reducing fishing pressure on some fish stocks. Some council members have expressed that there may be other ways to address the council's concern in the for hire fishery that do not include a moratorium. Also, concern has been raised over conflicts between those who do and do not get permits, issues with the current control date of June 15, 2016, such as what will happen to permits obtained after that date, the potential to lead to creation of sector separation, and associated conflicts such as those between private recreational fishermen and the for hire fleet, and also the expense of obtaining a for hire permit if permits are to become limited in number, and how to ensure new entrants are allowed into the fishery. This slide shows the distribution of vessels with the snapper grouper for hire permit by state and by region. Overall, the majority of permits, or permitted vessels rather, are in the state of Florida, with most being either on the Florida East Coast or in the Florida Keys. There are also several permits in North Carolina, South Carolina, also in Georgia, and then the rest of the permits are distributed along the Gulf Coast, the Mid-Atlantic region, a few in New England, and also in a handful in non-coastal states. As a little bit of additional background, as far as permit distribution, this slide shows the number of permitted vessels by state throughout the South Atlantic region and then all other states combined over the past 10 years. And at the very right, you'll see the variation in permit numbers from year to year. The permit numbers have remained relatively steady throughout the time series, with the exception of, as you can see at the very end, 2015, 2016, 2017, there's been a generally increasing trend in the number of permits. Under a moratorium, there are several different decision points that the Council would have to make as far as eligibility criteria, one of which would be the start date of the moratorium. Currently, a control date of June 15, 2016 for the for-hire sector of the snapper grouper fishery has been put in place. For those not familiar with the control date, this is a publicized date specified by the Council to notify current and potential future fishery participants that the Council is considering restrictions limiting participation in a fishery. Participants who enter the specified fishery or sector will not be assured of future access should a management change that limits participation in the sector or the fishery be prepared and implemented. As far as the start date of a potential moratorium, the Council could use the current control date of June 15, 2016 to determine eligibility for those that do or do not receive a permit. The Council could also use another date or a set of dates. And so on this note, a question from the Council: if a moratorium is imposed, what date should the Council consider when determining who receives a permit? Council members have expressed concern over permit speculation or a run on permits, where some people may have purchased or will purchase a snapper grouper for-hire permit for reasons other than its intended use of gaining access to the snapper grouper for-hire fishery. The reason people would do this would be potential benefit from the sale of the permit in the future. So a question from the Council regarding permit speculation is: should the Council be concerned over permit speculation? And if so, what should the Council do to avoid a run on permits? Council may also consider exceptions to eligibility. So these would be conditions to allow fishery participants who do not meet the moratorium control date or start date eligibility requirements to still obtain a snapper grouper for-hire permit under a moratorium. One example of this could be for historic captains. So this would be designed to be inclusive of individuals who have worked on vessels under the permit of another person or a corporation, and if they could prove they had done so, they would receive a snapper grouper for-hire permit under a moratorium. Another exception could be for commercial snapper grouper license holders. This is designed to be inclusive of commercial snapper grouper license holders who have intended to incorporate for-hire fishing activity in the future as a way to diversify income or as a retirement option. This was a suggestion from the Council's snapper grouper advisory panel. So regarding exceptions to eligibility, questions from the Council include: should there be exceptions to the eligibility requirements or start dates set by the Council? And if so, do you have suggestions as to what they should be? Finally, when considering eligibility criteria, the Council can consider a target for the number of snapper grouper for-hire permits that should be in the fishery. They can set eligibility measures around this target number. The eligibility measures could be put in place that either freeze the number of permits at current levels, so freeze the current footprint, so to speak, allow the number of permits to increase, or potentially decrease the number of permits available. So as a question from the Council, should the Council aim to set the number of permits at the current number, a higher number, or should the Council seek to decrease the number of permits in the for-hire snapper grouper fishery? Under a moratorium, it would need to be considered how new entrants would be allowed into the snapper grouper for-hire fishery. One of the considerations for allowing new entrants would be the transferability of permits. Several options for transferability of permits under a moratorium exist, including open transfers with no restrictions, limited transfers such as to family members or between vessels with the same owner, or not allowing transfers at all. In this case, the permits would eventually be retired and could be renewed in a permits pool, which I'll get to in a minute. The transferability influences the value of a permit quite a bit, and also how new entrants are able to enter the fishery. And so on transferability, questions from the council include, should snapper grouper for hire permits be transferable under a moratorium? And if so, should there be restrictions on how and to who the permits can be transferred? Also, should leasing be allowed for snapper grouper for hire permits, where someone could temporarily lease a permit rather than having to buy it outright? Council has the option to establish a permits pool as a way to allow new entrants into the fishery, as well as recoup the use of permits as they are retired. In doing so, there's the need to establish when the permits would be made available, which could include as soon as they are retired, on a specific date each year, or when the number of permits meets a minimum threshold for the minimum number of permits that could be active in the fishery. Also, it would need to be specified how permits are made available to new entrants, which could include things such as a lottery system or a waiting list. And questions from the council in regards to a permits pool is, under a moratorium, should a permits pool be established to allow new entrants into the snapper grouper for hire fishery? If so, how should these permits be made available to new entrants? It has also been suggested that the council create a new entrants permit, also referred to as a greenhorn permit. This permit would allow new entrants into the for-hire fishery. It could be renewed for a limited number of years, after which time a permit holder would be eligible to receive a snapper grouper for-hire permit if proper documentation of for-hire fishing activity is made available. Documentation could include activity in the for-hire logbook, proof of income from for-hire fishing. There have been several provisions that could also accompany this new entrance permit, which include establishing a probationary period, requiring an annual U.S. Coast Guard safety inspection and placement of a safety decal for uninspected passenger vessels through the U.S. Coast Guard voluntary inspection program, or also passing a boating safety course, proof of captain's license, an additional fee, potentially only allowing the harvest of certain snapper grouper species under the new entrance permit, requiring letters of reference, requiring logbook training, and also making permits renewable for a calendar year on the same date for ease of enforcement. So questions from the council in regards to a new entrance permit are, should a new entrance, i.e. greenhorn permit, be established to allow new entrants into the for-hire fishery? If so, what provisions should accompany this permit? Also, how many new entrance permits should be made available each year? In addition to the new entrance permit, the council could consider multiple permit types for the snapper grouper for-hire permits. Currently, only one permit exists that covers both charter boats and head boats. The council could create two separate permits, one covering charter boats and one covering head boats. Under a moratorium, this could fix the level of effort per vessel based on the permit type. Also, the council could create different types of for-hire permits based on how long for-hire participants have been involved in the snapper grouper fishery. These could have varying eligibility and transferability provisions. And for example, the council could use the control date to determine transferability of a permit, with those who had the snapper grouper for-hire permit before the control date, their permit would have open transferability, while those who had the permit after the control date, there would be no transfers allowed. However, they would still be allowed to participate in the fishery. And questions from the council in regards to multiple permit types include, should the council consider multiple permit types for the snapper grouper for hire permit instead of the current single permit that covers both head boats and charter boats. Also, if a moratorium is implemented, should the council consider multiple permit types with different transferability provisions? If a moratorium is implemented, a time limit or a sunset provision could be established where the moratorium expires on a specific date or under a specific set of conditions. These conditions could include a change in stock status for a species or when a minimum target number of permits is reached in the fishery. Examples of a time-limited moratorium or a sunset provision include the king mackerel commercial permit, as well as the Gulf free fish and coastal migratory pelagic charter headboat permit, where all of these permits rather, had a moratorium implemented to begin with, followed by a limited entry system that was put in place. And questions from the council regarding a time limit or sunset provision include: should there be a specified end date or time limit established if a moratorium on snapper grouper for hire permits is implemented? If so, what length of time should be considered? We will now move on to the second major issue that's being considered in Snapper Grouper Amendment 47, which is the prohibition on retention of snapper grouper species in state waters when these species close to harvest in federal waters. This is really examining a condition of the snapper grouper for hire permit. And why is the council reconsidering this permit condition? There have been public comments over the inequity that occurs between operators that do and do not have the federal for hire permit when a snapper grouper species is closed to recreational harvest in federal waters, but recreational harvest remains open in state waters. Under these circumstances, customers on board for hire vessels with the federal for hire snapper grouper permit are not able to harvest these species even if they are fishing in state waters where the species can be legally retained otherwise. As an additional bit of background on this harvest prohibition, the regulatory language varies slightly by species, but is largely written as these bag and possession limits apply in the South Atlantic on board a vessel for which a valid federal commercial or charter vessel headboat permit for South Atlantic snapper grouper has been issued, without regard to where such species were harvested, i.e. in state or federal waters. So, if the bag limit or possession limit is 0, this applies to either a for hire or commercially permitted snapper grouper vessel, and really is a condition of the for hire snapper grouper permit. It is designed as a protective measure for snapper grouper stocks, and as you'll notice, the private recreational component is not included because there is no federal permit required for private recreational snapper grouper anglers. And the question from the council is, should the council change or remove the harvest prohibition for federal snapper grouper for hire permit holders on snapper grouper species in state waters when the species close to harvest in federal waters? So in other words, should this permit condition be changed? And finally, the council would like to know, are there other options that should be considered for snapper grouper for hire permits? Some other options that have been suggested include that the snapper grouper for hire permit could be tied to an individual rather than a vessel. This would allow operators the flexibility to easily change vessels if need be. Also, it has been suggested of attaching a standardized identifying number to the snapper grouper for hire permit in a similar manner as it is to limited entry permits. This would allow the better tracking of for hire permit holders over time. And some questions from the council on other options include, should a snapper grouper for hire permit remain tied to a vessel, or should it be tied to an individual being a person, a business, or otherwise? Also, should a consistent identifying number be attached to the snapper grouper for hire permit to allow better tracking of permit holders all over time? Additionally, are there other options that the council should consider in relation to a moratorium on snapper grouper for hire permits? And also, are there other ways that the council could address their concerns, i.e. the logbook reporting compliance, stabilizing participation in the fishery, fishing pressure on some stocks, etc., within the for hire snapper grouper fishery in without using limited entry. And a quick review of the potential amendment timing. Scoping webinars will be held in August. The Council will review the scoping comments received from these webinars as well as written comments at their September 2018 meeting. In-person scoping hearings are scheduled in October throughout the South Atlantic region. The Council would review these scoping comments as well as a draft amendment including actions and alternatives at their December 2018 meeting. The Council would again revise the actions and alternatives and approve the amendment for public hearings in March of 2018. These public hearings would occur in April or May of 2019, rather. And the Council would review the public hearing comments, potentially approve all actions and alternatives within the amendment at their June 2019 meeting, and final action would be taken to approve the amendment for secretarial review in September of 2019. And so what do you think the Council should do? The South Atlantic Fishery Management Council wants to hear from you. What do you think about the issues that were presented, considering the questions from the Council? Also, do you agree with what the Council is considering? Do you have other suggestions for how the Council should modify the snap grouper for hire permit? There will be several opportunities to provide your comments to the Council. There will be a total of 10 in-person scoping sessions that will be held throughout the South Atlantic region, where staff presentation will be given. This will be followed by a question and answer session and an opportunity to provide your comments on the record for the Council to review at their December 2018 meeting. These in-person scoping sessions will kick off on October 9th in Midway, Georgia and Nags Head, North Carolina. This will be followed by Morehead City, North Carolina, Murrells Inlet, South Carolina, Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, Hilton Head, South Carolina, Jacksonville, Florida, Melbourne, Florida, Jupiter, Florida, and finally in Key West, Florida. A scoping summary document, this presentation as well as the video are available on the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council's webpage, specifically at the link below. In addition to the in-person scoping sessions, written comments will be accepted as well. The deadline for written comments on Amendment 47 to be included in the comment overview for the December 2018 South Atlantic Fishery Management Council meeting is November 9th, 2018 at 5 p.m. The Council requests that you use the online public comment form available at the link below. Written comments will also be accepted by mail or fax. You can send written comments to Greg Waugh, the Executive Director of the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, 4055 Faber Place Drive, Suite 201, North Charleston, South Carolina 29405. Comments can also be sent by fax to 843-769-4520. And that's the end of this presentation. Is there something that was not covered? Do you have more questions? Please don't hesitate to contact us. For questions regarding Snapper Grouper Amendment 47, this amendment, please contact me, John Hadley, at 843-302-8434 or john.hadley@safmc.net. For general questions about the South Atlantic Council, you can contact Cameron Rhodes, Fishery Outreach Specialist, or Kim Iverson, our Public Information Officer. With that, thank you very much.